Sex evolution. Before expanding on the ideas of transmutation, both in their right form, from few existing sources, and their wrong form, from numerous sources, it's necessary first to expand upon aspects of the biology and function of sex, when it fulfills the first two designs of nature. Namely, it is necessary to establish whether sex in itself evolves. Can forms of evolving sex be found in humanity? Does the evolution of sex exist, that is the evolution of primary characters and evolution of sex functions? What does the evolution of sex function even mean? If evolution of sex exists, then there should be forms lower than the form we consider normal, and there should be forms higher than the form we set as a baseline. So what then is the lower form and what is the higher form? The moment we ask ourselves this question, we become confused and perplexed by the ordinary concept of naive Darwinism. Of the usual evolutionary theories that tell us of the lower forms of sex in lower organisms, in plants, in single-cell reproduction, of the propagation of fungi and so on. But all of this is outside the scope of the question set before us. We are dealing only with humanity, and must think therefore of mankind. In examining the question, we try to establish what constitutes normal sex, then determine the lower forms of the sex life of man. The forms that correspond to a degenerating type, or to a type arrested in its development, and then determine the higher type, evolving forms, if such forms actually do exist. The difficulty of defining normal sex is created first of all by the indeterminateness of the characteristics and properties of lower sex, by the absence of any understanding of what higher sex might be. Furthermore, at times even confusing the lower with the higher, the degenerating with the evolving. Taking all of this into consideration, it is necessary before attempting to define normal sex, to determine lower sex or infrasex. A beginning has to be made with infrasex because an understanding of suprasex can be arrived at only through the elimination of everything that is determined first of all as infrasex, and then secondly as normal sex. It is easier to establish infrasex if we take as its chief characteristic arrested development, a degeneration that has already begun or is beginning. The detection of infrasex is however impeded by the variety and contradictory character of the forms in which infrasex is manifested. Particularly by the fact that some of these forms, from the ordinary point of view, appear to be a strengthening and even the exaggerated development of sex energy, sex desires, and sex sensations. From the outset therefore, infrasex must be divided into two categories, obvious degeneration and hidden degeneration. To the first category of infrasex belong most declining forms of the manifestation of sex, such as all obvious sex abnormalities. That is underdeveloped sex, all perversions in the sense of either abnormal sex desires or abnormal sex abstinence. Disgust of sex, fear of sex, indifference to sex, interest in one's own sex, although the latter has quite different meaning in men from what it has in women, and in women it is not necessarily a sign of infrasex. To the second category of infrasex belong cases that are often connected with the heightened intensity of sex life, which while externally appearing to be normal, though exaggerated, in reality also point to inner degeneration. This category of infrasex will be dealt with later. For all categories of infrasex, the fundamental characteristic is the absence of coordination between the idea of sex and the ideas of other normal functions in us. Sex always leads people of infrasex either into temptation or sin, instability, distortion or debauchery. For a normal man or woman, sex contains no danger. In a normal human being, sex harmonizes with other functions, including the emotional and the intellectual, and even with the desire for the miraculous, if such exists in the soul. A person's thoughts, emotions, and aspirations, none contradict sex, nor does sex contradict them. Sex inwardly is completely justified in normal people, and this justification is based solely upon the full coordination of sex with their intellectual and emotional functions. However, if a person is born abnormal, or becomes abnormal, then a negative attitude towards sex and the condemnation of sex almost always grows within them. Abnormalities may be very different. There may be total impotence, incapacity both for external function and for sensation. There may be capacity for sensation connected with incapacity for external function, the presence of desires, but an impossibility to satisfy them. There may be capacity for external function connected with the complete absence of sensation, being numb to sex. There may be capacity for sensation only on the condition of abnormal external functions. In all of these cases, sex sensations are accompanied by a feeling of disharmony between sex and the other sides of our inner life, particularly with the higher, or those that are taken to be our higher centers. As a result, there arises a non-understanding of sex, a terror of sex, and even disgust of sex. Infrasex that condemns sex and repels it as offensive, represents a curious phenomena in the life of the history of humanity. In this case, sex and all that refers to sex is declared to be sin. Woman is the instrument of the devil and man is the devil, Pan, the goat and the tempter. The idea of purity is sexual impotence, infantile, senile or pathological, which in this case is manifested either through abstinence, taken for an act of will, or in absence of interest towards sex, which is explained by the prevalence of other spiritual interests. In people of infrasex, sex is sometimes more easily subordinated to intellectual and emotional tendencies, usually of a negative character, than in a normal man or woman. Sex has no independent existence in a being of infrasex, or in any case it differs greatly from sex in a normal individual. To someone of infrasex, therefore, a normal person appears as one possessed by some incomprehensible and hostile force. The being of infrasex considers it their duty to struggle against this force in other people, because they believe that they have conquered it in themselves. This explains the entire mechanism of the influence that infrasex has on life. Among other people, the people of infrasex appear the most moral, in religion the most saintly. It is easy for them to be moral and it is easy to be saintly. It is of course only pseudo-morality and pseudo-saintliness, however people generally live with pseudo-values and very few wish to find any real values in life. It is necessary to understand therefore that almost all the morality that has been imposed upon the human race, almost all the laws controlling our sex lives, almost all the restrictions guiding people's choice and decisions in these cases, all the taboos and fears, all have come from infrasex. Infrasex, precisely by virtue of its difference from normal sex, by virtue of its inability to become normal and by virtue of its non-understanding or normal sex, began to regard itself as superior. It began to dictate laws to normal sex. This does not mean that all morals, all laws, and restrictions relating to sex are wrong. But as often occurs in life, when right ideas come from the wrong source, then together with what is right, they bear within them a great deal that is wrong, that contradicts their fundamental essence, which brings about new confusion and new complications. In the history of mankind, it is impossible to find a more striking example of pathological forms making laws for normal forms, unless we take a broader view and realize that in fact, the entire history of mankind is nothing but the rule of pathological forms over normal. Furthermore, it is characteristic that while infrasex continually holds in suspicion and mercilessly condemns normal sex and its manifestations, it shows much more tolerance towards pathological and perverted forms. Thus infrasex always finds an excuse and justification for people of intermediate sex and for their tendencies, as well as for various abnormal means of sexual satisfaction. People of abnormal inclination are of course by this very fact people of infrasex. However, they are not aware of this and are often very proud of their difference from people of normal sex, whom they regard as coarse and animal, lacking the refinement they ascribe to themselves. There are even theories that regard intermediate sex as the result of evolution. All that's been said up until now refers only to one category of infrasex, although in this category there can clearly be seen several forms, from impotence to the modern trends regarding the multiplicity of genders. The other category of infrasex does not include either impotence or unnatural inclinations. As pointed out earlier, manifestations of this category, with the exception of extremes bordering on obvious insanity, are not usually taken as abnormal. Phenomena of this category can be divided into two groups. To the first group belong those manifestations of sex that are colored with what may be called the psychology of the lupiner. To the second group belong those manifestations of sex that are characterized by their close relation to oppressive and morbid emotions of a violent or despondent character. Both groups can be explained by the fact that sex, and all that relates to sex, possesses the capacity to connect itself with the most contradictory sides of a human being. In the first group, sex is connected with what is lowest in us. For such a person, sex is surrounded by an atmosphere of uncleanliness. One speaks and thinks of sex with unclean words and unclean thoughts. At the same time, they are a slave to sex and aware of their slavery. It appears to them that all other people are slaves, just as they are. They mentally throw dirt on sex and on everything connected with sex, invent indecent anecdotes or like to listen to them from others as a means to validate their views. Their whole life is full of obscene language, everything is as unclean to them as they are themselves. If they do not degrade sex, they deride it, takes it as a joke and try to find something comical to mock in sex. This looking for the comic in sex, the introduction of laughter into sex, gives rise to a special kind of pseudo-art. Pornography, which is characterized precisely by the derision of sex. Without this derision, erotic art, even in its extreme forms, may be quite normal and legitimate, as it was for instance in the Greek and Roman worlds, in ancient India, in Persia at the period of the flourishing of Sufism and so on. The absence of erotic art, or wrong forms of it, points on the contrary to the very low moral level of a particular culture, and to the preponderance of infrasex within it. Infrasex in all of its manifestations of course tries to confuse erotic art with pornography. For infrasex, there is no difference between these two phenomena. With regard to normal sex, it is necessary to point out that there is no laughter. The function of sex cannot be comical, it cannot be the object of a joke. This is one of the characteristics of normal sex, which can be fun, but never the object of satire. To continue the enumeration of the features of that form of infrasex that is characterized by the psychology of the lupanar, it may be said that this form is determined by the separation of sex from other functions, and by the antagonism of sex to all other functions. For intellectual and for emotional life, even merely for physical activity, in the case of the people of this form of infrasex, sex is only an impediment, an obstacle and a waste of force, a waste of energy. This waste of energy in sex functions, and the realization of this waste, is one of the distinctive traits of the form of infrasex in question. In normal sex this waste does not exist, since energy is immediately renewed because of the richness and positive nature of the sensations, thoughts and emotions connected with sex. It's a gift, and nurturing between willing participants. This form of infrasex is often active in its manifestations in life and is widespread. Owing to many peculiarities in our lives, particularly owing to the power of the abnormal over the normal, and of the lower over the higher. Many people that do not in fact belong to infrasex, learn about sex only from people of this form, in words and expressions belonging to this form of infrasex, and they at once receive a shock from sex as if it were unclean. They are repelled by the psychology of the lupanar, but cannot throw out the impressions they have received. They begin to believe that there is nothing else, and the whole of their mentality with regard to sex becomes colored and impregnated with distrust, suspicion, fear and even repugnance. Their fears and their repugnance with relation to this form of the manifestations of sex would be well grounded if only they knew that the abnormal cannot be taken as the law for the normal, and that in avoiding the abnormal it is important not to sacrifice the normal. Sex in this form is very closely related to crime, and in actual life a criminal character or criminal tendencies are scarcely met with apart from this form of infrasex. Even in ordinary scientific psychology this form of sex manifestation, which is devoid of any connection with moral feeling, is defined as the lower or bestial. It is the predominance of this form of infrasex in life that shows the level on which humanity stands today. In the second group of manifestations of this category of infrasex, in the group in which sex functions are not decreased but on the contrary are even increased in comparison with the normal, sex is connected with all that is violent and cruel in us, with sadism, with control and even with masochism. A person of this form of infrasex seems continually to be walking on the edge of a precipice. Sex and all emotions belonging to sex become in them inevitably connected with irritation, suspicion, jealousy and even paranoia. At any moment they may find themselves completely in the power of a sense of injury, insulted self-pride, a frightened sense of ownership. There are no forms of cruelty or of violence of which they are not capable in order to avenge this outraged honor or injured feeling. All manifestations of crimes of passion without exception belong to this form of infrasex. The words of Professor Troelsen were quoted previously, which stated that many efforts and prolonged work on oneself are necessary in order to become accustomed to the teaching of relativity. However, much greater mental effort is needed in order to see infrasex and nothing else, in all the crimes and murders that are committed from jealousy, suspicion, desire for revenge, delusion, persecution, and so on. If we make this effort and understand that in the figure of Othello there is nothing but pathology, abnormal and perverted emotions, then the lies by which humanity has lived and lives become clearer to us. The difficulty in understanding the nature of this particular category of infrasex is created by the continual establishment of, and the desire to ennoble, to justify all manifestations of violence and degenerate emotion connected with sex and with crimes of passion. All the power and the hypnosis of art, literature, and the media are directed towards the glorification of these emotions and these crimes. It is this hypnosis that above all stands in the way of the right understanding of things, and makes people who do not belong to infrasex consider themselves obliged to think, feel, and act like people of infrasex. All that has been said about infrasex can be summarized therefore in the following propositions. The first category of infrasex, from impotence to perversions, borders on manias and phobias, on pathological proclivities and pathological fears. The second category, in its first animal form, is near to idiocy and to absence of any moral feeling. In its second more violent form, it has resemblance to delusional insanity or to homicidal mania, and even in its milder manifestations, is full of fixed ideas and fixed mental images that are accompanied or evoked by tormented and violent emotions.